Yeah, no, I think I'll just quickly. So, welcome everyone who's been kind enough to tune in to another installment of our ORC seminars. And yeah, we're honored to have Dr. Jeff Muntifering speak to us today on some of the work that Save the Rhino Trust does. But yeah, that's about it for the introduction. Jeff, I'll just hand it over to you. And yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, well, thanks, Frowen, for organizing. Always great to connect, even if virtually with you guys up at ORC and wherever else. So, and of course, happy to share a little bit about what has been done, what we're busy working on, and where we're looking to take some of our science work and how we integrate it with a lot of our more programmatic efforts out in the great Northwest and also beyond. So yeah, I think my talk today will be fairly high level. I'm going to kind of introduce briefly, I guess, our kind of fundamental approach, both in terms of how we design our research and how we design our programs, because they're very interlinked. And then I will run through a number of the projects that we've done. I'm kind of narrowing my window here to sort of the last 10 to 15 years. Um, but we'll talk about, or I'll present work that has been done, how it's fit into a lot of our projects, and then I will talk about what projects that we are keen to continue exploring. And again, for folks listening, like if anything, I don't know, piques your interest, we can always chat more about it afterwards, and or beyond this talk. I think it'd be great to keep working together. Teamwork wins. So I thought what I'd do first is just share a little bit about how I got into research. I grew up in Minnesota, some of you might know, and my sort of science background began with wolves. Did a lot of different kinds of wolf research. This is me standing in front of one of those old school telemetry tracking vehicles. I'll never forget one of my first weeks out. We were tracking, most of the tracking was done at night and driving around in these farmlands up in northwestern Minnesota, trying to keep track of the wolves. You know, you're watching the road, watching your dials, and you're not watching other
Mhm.
things that are hanging over the road. And I took off our whole antenna system on my second night out. Wasn't a great first impression, but things went better afterwards. After it was fairly brief, actually, just about 6 months working in Minnesota, I got invited by Dr. Laurie Marker, who many of you know, to come to Namibia. So I landed here in December 1999, and with my box of cheetah poop that she had sent to my house in Minnesota, I made my way up to Cheetah Conservation Fund, where my first task was to essentially study cheetah feeding ecology, which meant picking through poop, creating glass slides and voucher specimens for different ungulates, and trying to understand, yeah, what the diet makeup was, what the proportional importance of different species were. And we got a nice little publication out of that back in 2003. And then a few years later, I did my master's work also up at the Cheetah Conservation Fund. And this was more of a habitat modeling project that we did across the farmlands. So some interesting cheetah work there. But about the same time, I was also getting more involved with the Minnesota Zoo, which is my current employer, particularly the late Dr. Ron Tilson, who, funny enough, also has a connection here in Namibia with Gobabeb, where he was a postdoctoral student way back in the late 60s, early 70s, I believe. But he invited me to go to China to survey for tigers. So this was in 2001, 2002. And through a lot of that work, we published a few papers, some book chapters, basically documenting the decline of and in situ extinction of wild South China tigers. But really incredible experience which, I take a lot of that away today. And it was in 2003 then that I sort of migrated and found my way up to the great Kunene here in Namibia. I was busy running a student research program based at the Cheetah Conservation Fund called Round River Conservation Studies, which does semester programs for U.S. students. And we were invited to come out to check out Save the Rhino Trust. We met their research director, the late Mike Hearn. He was busy doing a PhD at the time and was really looking for some cheap labor, I believe, and some young students to come and help him out. So this was our first campus there at Palmbach way back in 2003, where our students stayed. Again, working with Mike Hearn on a lot of different kinds of projects, particularly rhino ecology and biology, which I'll mention a little bit later. But just by way of introduction of Save the Rhino Trust, I know some of you are fairly familiar, but it's the oldest rhino conservation organization in the world, over 40 years now, in existence since 1982, working up in the northwest part of Namibia. Founded by the late Blythe Lutie with help from her husband Rudy, who was working with the government at the time in the Skeleton Coast Park. And I think what's unique about SRT is, they're really one of the early organizations that actually employed local people, some of them even ex-poachers, to rather work to protect wildlife. This is fairly common now, but 40 years ago, this was completely unheard of. And of course, they got a lot of backlash for this. A lot of this thinking also was aligned with Garth Owen Smith and his work with Margie Jacobson and IRD&C, again, working with local people to try and combat the poaching of that time. And today, our CEO is Simpson Urikpub, who hails from Correas, an incredible amount of experience and expertise, 30 plus years working for the trust, obviously born and raised in the region. So Simpson's been a great leader for us over a number of years. But my role really began then in 2006, shortly after Mike Hearn sadly passed away. Did my best to step into his role as a science advisor, and really trying to spend as much time as I could out in the field in those days. This is me with our camel team. And SRT basically, the whole field staff are out 3 weeks every month, on foot or vehicle, or back then donkey, looking for rhinos. We know all the rhinos by ear notch and horn shape. We have established a database from the late 80s tracking individual rhinos, very similar to Ongava. And my work was to try and familiarize myself with this and then try and see how I could take a lot of Mike Hearn's work forward from then on out. And a lot of this at those times was actually still under Round River, my previous employer, but in 2009, I was adopted by Minnesota Zoo to be based here in Namibia, working basically full-time as SRT's science advisor. I toss this in here. I know most of you know Kunene and the Rhino Range, but I thought maybe there might be somebody from outside there. It's a massive area up in the northwest, 2.8 million hectares. If anybody from Europe is on or is listening, it's basically the size of London all the way up to Manchester, that the northwest or West Kunene, as we call them, Black Rhinos range. Huge landscape, a lot of responsibility to try and keep track of all those rhinos. And the context is also very important for a number of reasons. I mentioned the size, very low human population density, in fact, one of the lowest in the world, less than 1 person per square kilometer. In terms of land tenure, we've got 2 tourism concessions within the range, Palmbach and Etendeka. Hoboteri there on the western side of Etosha is a third, but not technically within the Rhino Range. We have 4 larger ethnic groups that are in or around the range: Ahimba, Herero, Namadamara, and Rimfasmak. which we work with all of them. And then there's three main NGOs working in the conservancies: Save the Rhino, IRDNC, and Namibia Nature Foundation, who many of you are familiar with. IRDNC works mainly north of the red line, the veterinary fence, whereas NNF primarily south. And then, of course, our main partners that we work with, especially over the last decade, have been the communal conservancies. So you can see them in darker green outlined there. 13 of them that basically we have formal partnerships with through our Rhino Ranger program, which I will mention in a second. But the rhinos are very unique. It's one of the last free roaming rhino populations in West Kunene, and it's the largest to persist on unprotected land. So basically all the other black rhinos in the world live within parks, fenced parks, scattered around Africa, with only a few exceptions. Ours obviously are extremely resource limited, less than 100 rainfall per year. As many as you know, we're still kind of lingering in a 13-year drought, with every year basically being less than 100 millimeters in most places. So very, very dry. And then, like I mentioned, monitored by Save the Rhino Trust, which operate, one of the only NGOs in the country that operate under a formal MOU with the government to do this work. So we've all probably heard about the poaching crisis also. You can see the sharp climb from 2010, 2011. So of course, this sparked a lot of urgency among rhino conservation practitioners. You guys at Ongaba were the same, part of a lot of those early meetings, trying to figure out how Namibia was going to get on top of things off in the Northwest. We had a big meeting in 2010 where the ministry invited a lot of local communities, the NGOs. Of course, they chaired things themselves, and this meeting was critical for a number of reasons, but I think one of the biggest ones was, for the first time, the conservancy leadership that was represented at this meeting stood up and basically stated or pledged that they wanted their rangers, their game guards, to be directly involved in monitoring rhino, number one, and number two, they wanted SRT and IRDNC to help them, to basically transfer the skills that they've honed, help their rangers become proficient in the same kinds of work, and to partner together in this. And this pledge basically launched, our Rhino Ranger program, which I'll mention in a minute. But it also, I think, gets to the fundamental dimensions of how we, at least in the Northwest, I think, see the problem, the poaching problem. And I think this is really critical whenever you're thinking about any project or even research project. Really thinking carefully about the problem that you're trying to solve. And for rhino conservation, I think typically what is the definition that floats around is the problem is poaching, and therefore we need to catch poachers. I remember being in a couple of rhino science meetings where literally there's actually a cost-benefit equation that sometimes comes up on the wall. Obviously, the benefit is the money from the poaching, and the cost is the likelihood of getting caught, and then the penalty, which obviously benefits are hard to deal with, but if you can increase the cost of getting caught and the penalties, you should be able to make some headway according to that worldview. But what we sort of see, and I like to use the iceberg as a metaphor here, it's certainly important to catch poachers. You can't just let people go scot-free, but there's a much deeper problem going on here. And the way that we reframe this, at least in the West, is kind of by two questions. How can we improve the value that local people attach to saving rhino, and who gets to decide how they're managed and protected? And I think if we think about the problem in those two ways, we start getting at a very different set of strategies and solutions, particularly those that look to engage and empower local people, and even more fundamentally, how can we improve stewardship, local stewardship over those rhinos? This was all, much more defined in our most recent strategic plan, but it's really been embedded and institutionalized now in pretty much everything that we do. So what does that look like in practice? Again, we like the three-legged pot rule, and the way that SRT sort of set up a lot of its programs within its new strategic plan focuses on rangers, the core monitoring work that we do there on the left. Once rangers become proficient, they become assets, especially to their communities, and they can lead tourism trips, which we've been doing for the past 20 years, also originating out of Desert Rhino Camp. And then more recently, to complement a lot of this more ranger-focused work, we've launched our Rhino Pride campaign, which involves a number of target audience groups that we reach out to and provide different kinds of interventions, different kinds of rhino messaging, again, all to try and improve that value that people attach to rhinos. But the big question here, and which I think focus of talk will shift now, is how can science help this? How do we integrate research and a bit of theory into our thinking about how these programs are designed and delivered? So I'll start just briefly with again, our core work, which is our Conservancy Rhino Ranger program. This is a very simplified, but I think still useful way of illustrating our theory of change for again, how we believe that engaging and empowering local people is going to lead to more protected rhino. And I won't go through this whole thing now, but if you dig in there and you look at some of those particularly highlighted bold words, they all boil down to values. And, this is all, based on a lot of social and psychological theory that we have drummed up. We published a little article about this back in 2015, I think. But again, using some science to help think through the different causal linkages between our strategies and our outcomes, which I think is really useful to have. And what that program has achieved, again, this is obviously correlative and not causal at all, but you can see the red line, which is poaching. You can see the growth in the patrol effort that we've been able to achieve through the Rhino Ranger program. Again, this is a long story, so I won't go into it now, but clearly there's a pretty strong relationship there, not just with the overall patrol effort, but also the proportional effort, which I think is most interesting, that as soon as the Conservancy Rangers became essentially 50% or above in terms of their contributions, you see that low poaching level sustained over time, which is pretty cool. Okay, so I'm going to shift now into more of the specific research that we have done, breaking it into sort of 4 components, and talking about basically real quickly again what we have done, what we've published, and then kind of where we're thinking of heading. So the first sort of dimension that we've done some work on is rhino ecology and behavior. And this goes back actually to about 2004, 2005, when we were quite involved in the People's Park, the previous People Park story. We did a lot of focal species habitat modeling, one of them being Black Rhino. So this was actually in the early days of resource selection functions, statistical modeling. So again, using our database to help generate these spatially explicit models that were really quite useful in terms of the planning for that park. And then, of course, 2003, with the launch of Desert Rhino Camp, opened up a whole huge opportunity to do some research. We, to be honest, really didn't know what we were doing coming in terms of the tourist rhino guide SRT interactions. So we did some research on rhino behavior around tourists. We published 2 articles, one which focused more on how the area, or how best to use the area in terms of vehicles and airstrips and all the different potential disturbance factors. And then we published another one that dove more into developing the actual viewing protocol, again, using using some modeling to try and understand how close and how long tourists could stay to minimize the chances of that rhino becoming disturbed, because our overall goal was to try and view the rhino without the rhino even knowing that we're there. And a lot of this work actually was part of my PhD back in those days. In terms of what we'd like to explore, definitely some more rhino-human interaction study. We haven't done any other follow-up work with the viewing protocols. A lot of opportunity there. There's some really interesting stuff that's come out over the last number of years on white rhino communication, olfactory communication, even synthesizing some pheromones, putting in rhino dung and video recording how different rhinos behave and react to it. I think there'd be some really interesting things we could do on that. With Black Rhino, impacts and management interventions on behavior, for sure. There's still a lot of management going on, dehorning, all that stuff. Climate change is a big one. Recently just met with Guy Midgley, who's a big climate modeler from Sandby, and I think he's at Stellenbosch now. But he's got a whole slew of PhD students that they're hoping to bring in, I believe, next year. And he's looking for some projects. So there might be some really interesting stuff that we can do there. And then, of course, updating some of the rhino habitat work that we've been doing. There's, again, an unprecedented amount of proposals for mining companies, things like that, and some more recent modeling and data of rhino habitat would be very useful in that context. So the second dimension then is, again, more the ecological population performance and dynamics. So most importantly, every year we compile an annual population assessment. So this includes sort of all of the standard metrics that the IUCN African Rhino Specialist Group do or promote, things like intercalving intervals, numbers of rhinos under 1 in the population, number of rhinos under 2 in the population. So we report out all of that. Of course, all the individual sightings, any mortalities, and then produce basically an all count population estimate then for the year. A lot of work goes into that. We've published some work on the effects of dehorning in Namibia with the colleagues from the UK. And then quite a number of years ago, we did some other population viability modeling in the Northwest, looking at population recovery. And then most recently, of course, some of you remember our modeling project that we did based at Ongava, mostly during COVID. So first time Namibia has ever allowed that amount of information to be published on their rhinos. So that was a big milestone, I think, for all of us. And we're very happy about that. And I'll mention how we're taking that forward now, too, in a bit. But in fact, there it is. We want to develop a rhino population viability analysis, which takes the parameter estimates that we were able to derive and start looking at projections into the future, how we might see rhino populations growing, decreasing under different management scenarios, which factors or variables are most sensitive to different conditions like climate change or poaching. All those things can be answered. And then, looking at other relationships between performance and parameters, how behavior change interventions and outcomes may integrate into a PVA. This is also quite interesting, a very cutting edge approach that's being used now. So plenty to do on that front as well. Third segment here, rhino monitoring, management, and tourism. So again, going back to that park story, we published a handful of ecological assessment documents, not just using rhinos, but with elephants, lions, a number of other species, connectivity for the whole landscape. So that was a big 2 to 3 year project that we did. More recently, we've looked at SMART, Implementing SMART, especially with community members. So SMART conservation software is basically a computer tool that is very user-friendly and user-useful for managing spatial data, as well as reporting it out. So it's great for yeah, especially when you can track individual animals, saves a lot of time and is really slick to use. So we're promoting that. We've done some work, again, evaluating our tourism and looking at using some choice experiments with Robin Naidu from WWF. You know, what factors sort of play into guests' willingness to pay, again, to try and promote various investments from communities, which we're always trying to motivate for more investment from the conservancies, which was kind of interesting. That study found that tourists were very interested in that factor and very were willing to actually pay quite a bit more if they knew a bigger portion would go back to the local community. So some interesting stuff there. In terms of going forward, we'd love to expand some of the dehorning work. There's been some really interesting stuff that's come out lately from South Africa about dehorning, a lot of mixed results, some again showing that it's problematic, others showing that it's, I won't say the silver bullet, but it seems to be the only thing that's stymieing poaching. So I think there's still a lot to be learned about that. We're also doing some work, just started looking into ranger motivations and decision making, particularly around welfare, which is a massive underappreciated dimension of ranger work. Love to get back into some of the rhino connectivity and conservation area design. There's some new developments with MarkSand, which is a great planning tool to use. We've looked at, again, rhino impact assessment models. Again, these are great for mining, addressing some of those issues. And then sort of generally how to improve some of the decision-making processes around rhino management. That's a tough nut to crack, but, you know, again, if there's a way that we can play a role in that, would love to. Okay, and the last little dimension that I'll talk about is some of our work with policy sciences and impact evaluation. This is kind of what I'm mostly excited about these days. We've published some interesting stuff looking into poaching, recruitment, and different perceptions of different stakeholders around what the problem is. This is with a student from Yale. We've published some more stuff on tourism that looks into, again, I think a rather underappreciated dimension of conservation tourism, if you call it, which is actually the decision process and partnership approach between business and conservationists. Trying to outline exactly how we managed to get that to work, offering some lessons learned. And then our Rhino Ranger program in general, you know, again, using social context and the frameworks for understanding that and how that figures into, again, the project design, sort of the stuff that I talked about at the beginning. But the things we're working towards now is I'm actually busy working on a manuscript for a 10-year evaluation using some process tracing methodologies with our ranger program. So that's going to go into conservation science and practice, hopefully. And then, you know, really looking into more of these qualitative and quantitative measures for outreach intervention. We've got, again, a number of these going on with our Pride campaign, but we haven't really set up any instruments yet to establish whether or not our assumptions, particularly in our theories of change, are actually holding up if we're achieving impact. So that's high on the priority list. And then looking at possibly expanding even out of West Kunene and seeing if we can use some of this science and social context for understanding more about how to help with the current escalation of poaching in Etosha. And I'll jump quickly into what we have been doing over the past year or so with a PhD candidate Hale Shanika, who's been working up there, doing a lot of survey work with community members across that northwestern border of Etosha, basically trying to understand sort of what factors or how people are experiencing rhino poaching and rhino conservation up there, and particularly some of the barriers to reporting and working together in a more collaborative way with the ministry to help reduce the poaching. A few years ago, we hosted a foreign student from University of Aberdeen, Ruben Schneider, and he's just recently now put out his PhD thesis, which is very interesting. The Inclusive Fortress, which basically looked at the ethnography of militarized and community-based conservation in Northwest. So again, going around highly qualitative data, a lot of open interview structures, understanding both ranger perspectives as well as local community perspectives, how they experience, again, rhino conservation and rhino poaching. And we're figuring out how to best use that new knowledge set to improve a lot of our work as well. As I mentioned before, we managed to kick off our first rhino population viability analysis. So we had a workshop in March, I believe, down in Windhoek, actually at the Ongava boardroom there. We had a science director for the IUCN Conservation Planning Specialist Group who was here, who facilitated the process. Those are just a few of the preliminary outputs from the PVA, again, looking at top graph their probability of extinction given different kinds of scenarios, looking at poaching threats primarily and drought frequencies. Again, looking at how population abundances might vary over the years according to different climate scenarios. And the last one there, which is pretty interesting, in the Far East, looking at different kinds of supplementation efforts for the government for the new rhino population there in Cowdom. If they add certain number of rhinos each year for 10 years under different scenarios, what we might expect that population to do. So that's pretty exciting stuff, I think. And then I just thought I'd mention a few other quick things here before we go into questions. We have launched a new financing mechanism, particularly for our rangers. I won't go into the details of the financing mechanism right now, but what I wanted to mention is that this is all based on our database. So our smart conservation software system was linked up using Smart Connect, which allows the smart database to actually be put on a cloud server, and ran through a blockchain technology from our partner IT services down in Cape Town to then create these automated certificates. When rangers achieve a certain amount of performance, these certificates get minted and they go out on a marketplace and people can buy them. So it's a sort of a type of a biodiversity credit scheme, which is starting to take wind now after the carbon market. And yeah, it's a pretty exciting new way to try and, again, integrate science into other dimensions of our work. I just thought I'd mention quickly a little bit about expansion. So as some of you know, we have been invited to expand out to the Far East there in Cowdom, just outside of Tumkwe, where they do have some black rhino. And again, working to develop the community ranger base there and ranger program. We've also been doing some work at Tosha Heights, bringing SMART to their data monitoring, as well as Ongava. It's been a while, so I should have mentioned Ongava also in here, where we've been working again with Stu and Abby on getting SMART up and running there in Ongava. And then beyond Namibia, we've also been invited to Nepal to help sort of establish a very similar community ranger program up in the Annapurna area, which is in the Himalayas on the border with China. Again, using very similar approach. Obviously, there's a much bigger conflict dimension or coexistence that we're trying to promote, but again, fundamentally, this issue of complementing a lot of the law enforcement with more community engagement. And I thought I would end just with a little slide here, again, talking about kind of partnering and collaborating here in Namibia. We all know it's not easy for a lot of grad students to get out and about. So some exciting stuff on the horizon is getting some infrastructure up and available for students, particularly here in Namibia. It would be great to get more students out. And we're kind of looking at sort of three areas. Well, you guys are already well established there at Ongava, but we recently have upgraded the Klein Dobe camp, which sits just outside of the Sikareti Gate in Kaudum. Fully equipped at the moment with classrooms, lodging, all that stuff. And then at World's End in the far west, I know this is a far cry from student housing at Ongava, but hey, you know, students are students. So we've installed a few Wendy houses that should be ready. This is basically just the installment of the main section, but we will be putting up shade cloth and getting them outfitted over the next few months. So hopefully we can get some residents and we can keep pursuing a lot of that additional work that we aim to achieve. And I will end there. I've probably talked too long already, but if anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to fire away.